The air in the lawyer's office was thick with the scent of old paper and stale grief, a fragrance I had become all too familiar with in my line of work, though never in a room so plush. My siblings, Lucas and Clara, were draped over their leather chairs like wilted aristocrats, their mourning attire a little too perfectly tailored, their sorrow a little too performative. They had always been good at playing their parts. I, on the other hand, felt like a crow in a peacock enclosure, my simple black dress and the rigid set of my shoulders a stark contrast to their practiced elegance. My name is Sullivan, and in that room, I was the forgotten child, the one who had chosen duty over dynasty, service over subservience. The tension was a living thing, coiling in the space between us, tightening with every tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. Mr. Albright, the family lawyer for as long as I could remember, cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound silence. He peered at us over his half-moon glasses, his expression a careful mask of professional neutrality. He held a thick sheaf of papers, the last will and testament of a man I had once called father. Lucas shot me a look of pure, unadulterated triumph, a smirk playing on his lips that he barely bothered to conceal. Clara, ever the more subtle of the two, simply adjusted her pearl necklace, her eyes glittering with a cold satisfaction. They thought they had won. They thought this was the final act of a play they had directed for years, the culmination of a lifetime of whispers and manipulations designed to paint me as the prodigal, the unworthy. They had no idea that the script had a final, unread scene, a twist that would unravel everything they had so carefully constructed. The lawyer began to read, his voice a dry monotone, and with every word I could feel their victory solidifying, their smugness radiating like heat from a furnace. They were about to get everything they had ever wanted, and I, the outlier, was about to be officially cast out. But I held my ground, my posture unwavering, my gaze fixed on a point just beyond the window. They didn't know the woman I had become. They didn't understand the steel forged in the crucible of deserts and the ice that had settled in my soul from witnessing things they could never imagine. They saw a quiet, unassuming woman in a plain black dress. They were about to learn that quiet did not mean weak, and that the deepest waters often hide the most formidable currents. The reading of the will was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of theirs. The years leading up to that day had been a slow, methodical erosion of my place in the family. It began when I was 18, fresh out of high school, with a fire in my belly and a yearning for something more than the gilded cage my father had built for us. He was a man of immense wealth and influence, a titan of industry who saw his children as extensions of his own legacy. Lucas was to be his heir in business, a role he embraced with a chilling ambition, his every action a calculated move on a corporate chessboard. Clara was to be the socialite, her marriage a strategic alliance, her life a carefully curated display of elegance and connections. And I was supposed to be the quiet, dutiful daughter, the one who would marry well, produce grandchildren, and fade gracefully into the background. But I had other plans. The day I told my father I was enlisting, the ground had seemed to shift beneath my feet. His face, usually a mask of controlled authority, had contorted with a rage that was both terrifying and in a strange way liberating. "You are throwing your life away," he had boomed, his voice echoing through the cavernous study. "You are spitting on everything I have built, everything I have given you." I tried to explain, to make him understand that I wasn't running away from something, but towards something. I spoke of purpose, of service, of a calling that was as real to me as the dividends and stock prices were to him. He didn't hear me. All he saw was defiance, a betrayal of the path he had so meticulously laid out. Lucas and Clara, of course, had fanned the flames. I remember Lucas's smug words, delivered with a casual cruelty that was his trademark. "Let her go, Dad. Let her play soldier. She'll come crawling back soon enough." Clara had been more insidious, her whispers like poison in our father's ear. "She's always been so rebellious, so ungrateful. It's for the best, really. She'll only embarrass us." And so I left. I traded silk dresses for camouflage, society balls for grueling training exercises, the scent of expensive perfume for the metallic tang of cordite, and I thrived. I found a new family in the brotherhood and sisterhood of the armed forces, a sense of belonging I had never known within the cold, marble walls of my childhood home. I rose through the ranks, my dedication and leadership earning me respect and accolades. I became Major Sullivan, a woman defined not by her lineage, but by her actions. My contact with my family dwindled to stilted phone calls on holidays, conversations filled with unspoken accusations, and a chasm of misunderstanding. My father never once acknowledged my achievements. My promotions, my commendations, my tour of duty, they were met with a stony silence. To him, I was a failure, a stain on the family name. Lucas and Clara, meanwhile, cemented their positions as the golden children. Lucas's business ventures, often funded by our father, were celebrated as genius moves, his ruthlessness praised as a necessary trait for success. Clara's parties were the talk of the town, her influence growing with every carefully cultivated friendship. They sent me pictures sometimes, glossy photos of family vacations I wasn't invited to, of holiday gatherings where my absence was a glaring, unspoken statement. They were writing me out of the family history, one smiling snapshot at a time, and I let them. I poured my energy into my work, into the men and women who depended on me, into the missions that gave my life meaning. I built a fortress around my heart, a wall of discipline and duty that protected me from the pain of their rejection. I told myself I didn't need them, that their world of shallow ambitions and transactional relationships was one I was glad to be free of. But in the quiet moments, in the dead of night on a forward operating base thousands of miles from home, the ache of that loss would sometimes surface. A stray memory of a childhood long past, of a time before the disappointment had set in, before I had become the black sheep. The news of my father's illness reached me via curt email from Lucas. There was no warmth, no sense of shared grief. It was a business transaction, a notification of an impending change in the family's assets. He didn't ask me to come home. He didn't suggest I see our father one last time. It was a clear message. You are not welcome here. I debated for days, torn between my duty to my unit and the faint, flickering ember of hope that I could somehow make peace with my father before it was too late. In the end, my commanding officer made the decision for me. He saw the toll the news was taking on me, the cracks in my carefully constructed armor. "Go home, Major," he had said, his voice firm but kind. "Family is family. You don't want to live with regrets." So I took emergency leave and flew back to a world I no longer recognized. The family estate seemed even larger and more imposing than I remembered, a monument to a man I barely knew anymore. My arrival was met with a frosty reception. Lucas and Clara treated me like an intruder, their conversation ceasing whenever I entered a room, their eyes following me with a mixture of suspicion and disdain. My father was a shadow of his former self, his once powerful frame withered, his sharp mind clouded by illness and medication. Our final conversation was a disjointed, painful affair. He looked at me, his eyes struggling to focus, and for a fleeting moment I thought I saw a flicker of something, regret, perhaps, or even pride. But then the mask slipped back into place, and he spoke the words that would echo in my mind for weeks to come. "You chose your path, Sullivan. You made your bed. Don't expect any pillows from me." He died 2 days later. The funeral was a grand affair, a spectacle of wealth and influence. I stood at the back, an anonymous mourner at my own father's service. Lucas and Clara held court, accepting condolences with a practiced grace, their grief as manufactured as the designer clothes they wore. And now, here we were in the lawyer's office, the final act of their long and carefully orchestrated campaign to erase me. They thought they knew how this story ended. They had written the script, cast the characters, and set the stage. They were about to learn that the author of this particular drama had a flair for the unexpected. They had underestimated me, dismissed me, and discarded me. They were about to discover that the forgotten child had a memory like steel and a strength they could never comprehend. The silence in the room was a prelude, the calm before a storm of their own making. Mr. Albright adjusted his glasses, the slight movement drawing all our attention back to the document in his hands. He cleared his throat again, a dry, rustling sound that seemed to amplify the tension. "We'll begin with the preliminary bequests," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion. He droned on about charitable donations, provisions for longtime staff, and other minor details that were of little interest to my siblings. I could see them vibrating with impatience, their bodies taut with anticipation. Lucas tapped his fingers on the arm of his chair, a rhythmic, irritating sound that betrayed his carefully cultivated air of nonchalance. Clara kept glancing at her reflection in the polished surface of the mahogany table. patting her perfectly coiffed hair. They were like vultures circling a carcass, waiting for the moment they could swoop in and claim their prize. Then the lawyer reached the main portion of the will. "To my daughter, Clara," he read, "I bequeath the summer home on the coast, along with the art collection housed within it. May it bring you the social standing you have always craved." A small, satisfied smile touched Clara's lips. She shot me a look, a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of triumph in her eyes. It was a significant inheritance, a symbol of her status as the favored daughter. She had won, and she wanted me to know it. Next, it was Lucas's turn. "To my son, Lucas," Mr. Albright continued, his voice steady, "I bequeath my controlling shares in Sullivan Industries, the entirety of my stock portfolio, and the family's primary residence. You have proven yourself to be a worthy successor, and I trust you will continue to build upon the legacy I have created." Lucas couldn't contain his grin. It spread across his face, a wolfish, predatory expression that made my stomach churn. This was it. This was everything he had ever wanted, everything he had schemed and manipulated to obtain. He leaned back in his chair, the picture of a king who had just been handed his crown. He looked at me then, his eyes full of a cruel, mocking pity. He was the victor, the heir apparent, and I was the fool who had thrown it all away for a life of discipline and danger. The lawyer paused, and the silence that followed was heavy with expectation. Lucas and Clara exchanged a knowing glance. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the public declaration of my exile. "And finally," Mr. Albright said, his gaze shifting to me for the first time since the reading began, "regarding my daughter, Sullivan." He paused again, and I could feel my siblings holding their breath, their bodies leaning forward in anticipation of the final, crushing blow. The lawyer's eyes met mine, and for a fleeting second, I thought I saw a glimmer of something akin to sympathy in them. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same impassive, professional mask. He continued reading, his voice now carrying a weight it hadn't before. "Regarding my daughter, Sullivan, it is with a heavy heart that I must state the following. Her choices in life have been a profound disappointment to me. She has turned her back on her family, on the values I hold dear, and on the future I had envisioned for her. Therefore, I declare that she is to receive nothing from my estate. She is, for all intents and purposes, disinherited." The words hung in the air, sharp and brutal. A wave of something cold and hollow washed over me, but I refused to let it show. I kept my back straight, my chin high, my expression unreadable. I had expected this. I had prepared myself for this. But hearing it spoken aloud, in this formal, final way, still felt like a physical blow. A gasp of performative shock escaped Clara's lips, though her eyes danced with unconcealed glee. Lucas, on the other hand, made no attempt to hide his elation. He let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound of pure, unadulterated triumph. "Well," he said, spreading his hands in a gesture of mock sympathy, "I guess that's that. A shame, really, but you made your choice, didn't you, Sullivan?" They were reveling in my humiliation, savoring the moment of my ultimate defeat. They saw me as broken, as pathetic, as the prodigal daughter who had finally received her just deserts. They thought the story was over, that the final curtain had fallen on my place in the Sullivan family. But then, something unexpected happened. Mr. Albright, who had been gathering the papers as if to conclude the meeting, paused. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a second envelope, this one sealed with a thick wax stamp bearing my father's crest. It was addressed to me. "There is one final matter," he said, his voice cutting through my siblings' smug chatter. The room fell silent once more, a different kind of silence this time, one laced with confusion and a dawning sense of unease. "Your father left a codicil to his will," Mr. Albright explained, his eyes fixed on me. "A private addendum, to be opened only in the event of his death, and read aloud only after the main body of the will had been executed." Lucas's smile faltered. Clara's hand went to her pearls, a nervous gesture that betrayed her sudden anxiety. They exchanged a look, a flicker of uncertainty passing between them. This was not part of their script. This was an unrehearsed scene, a deviation from the narrative they had so carefully controlled. The lawyer broke the seal on the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. It was my father's handwriting, the familiar, strong strokes now slightly shaky, a testament to his failing health. Mr. Albright cleared his throat, but this time, the sound was different. It was imbued with a sense of gravity, of importance that had been absent before. He looked directly at me, and for the first time he addressed me not as Sullivan, the disowned daughter, but with a title I had earned, a title that defined who I was. "Major Sullivan," he began, his voice resonating with a newfound respect. "This is addressed to you." The air crackled with a sudden, palpable shift in power. Lucas's face, which had been a mask of triumphant glee just moments before, was now a canvas of stunned disbelief. Clara's mouth hung slightly open, her carefully constructed composure beginning to crumble. The room, which had been their stage, their arena of victory, was suddenly mine. The game had changed, and they were no longer the ones in control. The lawyer's voice, now infused with a solemnity that commanded attention, filled the suddenly still room. He began to read from the single sheet of paper my father's last, true words. "To my daughter, Sullivan," he read, and I noted the absence of the military title this time. This was personal. This was a father speaking to his child, not an industrialist dictating terms. "If you are hearing these words, it means I have failed. I have failed to tell you what I should have said long ago. I have let my pride, my stubbornness, and my own narrow vision of success blind me to the remarkable woman you have become." I could feel my siblings stiffen beside me. This was not the narrative of disappointment they had spent years cultivating. This was a confession, a recanting of the official story, and it was happening in front of the one person they had sought to humiliate. "I was wrong," the letter continued, and the simple, two-word admission landed with the force of a physical blow. "I saw your decision to join the military as a rejection of me, of everything I had built. I failed to see it for what it was, a pursuit of a different kind of honor, a different kind of strength. A strength, I now realize, that far surpasses my own." My gaze drifted to Lucas. The color had drained from his face, leaving his skin a pasty, unhealthy shade. His mouth was a thin, hard line, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning horror. He was realizing, too late, that the foundation of his victory was built on a lie. While your brother was learning to conquer boardrooms, you were learning to lead soldiers. While your sister was mastering the art of social diplomacy, you were navigating the complex realities of life and death in foreign lands. You chose a harder path, a path of sacrifice and service, and you walked it with a courage I never possessed. The lawyer's voice was the only sound in the room, each word a chisel chipping away at the smug facade of my siblings. Clara was fidgeting with the clasp of her purse, her knuckles white. The triumphant glitter in her eyes had been replaced by a frantic, cornered look. She was no longer the victor. She was a spectator at her own downfall. "Therefore," the letter concluded, its final sentences delivered with a resounding finality, "I hereby enact the primary clause of my estate, a clause known only to myself and my most trusted legal counsel, to supersede all previously stated bequests. The bulk of my estate, including the controlling shares in Sullivan Industries, the primary residence, and the entirety of my liquid assets, is to be held in trust. A trust to be managed not by the son who mirrored my ambition, but by the daughter who surpassed my character." The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum that sucked all the air from the room. It was a silence so profound that I could hear the frantic beating of my own heart. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were observing the scene from a great distance. The words had been spoken, the truth revealed, but the reality of their meaning had yet to fully sink in. Then, the silence was shattered. "This is preposterous," Lucas exploded, leaping to his feet. His chair scraped violently against the polished floor. "This is a fake, a forgery. He would never. He told me, he promised me." His voice cracked on the last words, a sound of pure, raw desperation. He turned to Mr. Albright, his face contorted in a mask of rage and disbelief. "You can't be serious. My father was not of sound mind when he wrote this. He was ill, he was confused. She must have manipulated him." Clara, for her part, seemed to have been struck dumb. She sat frozen in her chair, her face a pale, slack mask of shock. The pearls around her neck seemed to mock her, their lustrous sheen a stark contrast to the dull, lifeless expression in her eyes. Mr. Albright remained impassive in the face of Lucas's tirade. He calmly folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. "I can assure you, Lucas," he said, his voice cold and precise, "that your father was of perfectly sound mind when he wrote this codicil. He did so over a year ago, long before his health began to decline significantly. It was witnessed by 2 independent parties, and its legality is ironclad." He then turned his attention to me, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Major Sullivan," he said, his voice now imbued with a quiet respect. "Your father also left a personal letter for you to be read in private, and he stipulated that the trust would be under your sole control. You are, for all intents and purposes, the new head of this family." The weight of those words finally began to settle on me. I was not just an heir. I was a steward, a guardian of a legacy I had never wanted. The irony was staggering. The one thing I had run from, the world of wealth and power and corporate intrigue, was now mine to command. I looked at my brother, who was now pacing the room like a caged animal, his face flushed with a furious, impotent rage. I looked at my sister, who was staring at me with a look of utter bewilderment, as if seeing me for the first time. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted. The smugness, the condescension, the years of casual cruelty, it had all evaporated in the space of a few minutes, replaced by a raw, naked desperation. They had built their entire world on the assumption of my worthlessness, and that world had just come crashing down around them. They had celebrated my disinheritance, not realizing they were cheering at their own funeral. The lawyer cleared his throat, signaling the end of the meeting. "If there are no further questions," he said, pointedly ignoring Lucas's sputtering protests, "then we are concluded here. Major Sullivan, my office will be in touch to arrange the transfer of assets and to discuss the administration of the trust." He stood, offering me a small, respectful nod. I rose to my feet, my legs feeling strangely unsteady. I hadn't said a word throughout the entire revelation, and I didn't intend to start now. There was nothing to say. The will had said it all. I walked towards the door, my movements calm and deliberate. As I passed my siblings, I could feel their eyes on me, a mixture of hatred, fear, and a dawning, desperate hope. They were no longer the arbiters of my fate. They were supplicants, their futures now resting in the hands of the woman they had so eagerly cast aside. The room had gone from a place of public humiliation to the site of my silent, stunning victory. And as I stepped out of the oppressive atmosphere of the office and into the cool, clean air of the hallway, I felt not a sense of triumph, but a profound and unsettling quiet. The battle was over, but the war for what came next was just beginning. The days that followed the reading of the will were a blur of legal meetings, financial briefings, and a barrage of frantic, unanswered calls from Lucas and Clara. I moved into the main residence, the sprawling mansion that had always felt more like a museum than a home. The staff, who had once looked at me with a mixture of pity and condescension, now treated me with a deferential respect that felt both foreign and uncomfortable. I walked the cavernous halls, my footsteps echoing in the silence, trying to reconcile the woman I was with the position I now held. The house was filled with ghosts, with memories of a childhood that felt like it belonged to someone else. I found myself drawn to my father's study, the one room that had always been his sanctuary, his fortress of solitude. It was exactly as he had left it, the scent of leather and old books hanging in the air. On his desk, amidst a neat stack of papers, lay the personal letter Mr. Albright had given me. For days, I had avoided opening it, afraid of what I might find inside. Was it another confession, another apology? Or was it a final, posthumous attempt to control my life, to mold me into the heir he had always wanted? Finally, with a deep breath, I broke the seal. The letter was longer than the codicil, the handwriting more personal, more fluid. "My dearest Sullivan," it began, and the uncharacteristically tender salutation sent a pang through my chest. "If you are reading this, it means I have found the courage in death that I lacked in life. I am writing this not to excuse my actions, but to explain them, and to ask for something I know I do not deserve, your forgiveness." He wrote of his own upbringing, of a father who had valued strength and success above all else, who had instilled in him a fear of anything that deviated from the path of convention. He had, he admitted, repeated the same mistakes with his own children, pushing Lucas towards a ruthless ambition that had hollowed him out, and encouraging Clara's obsession with a social status that was ultimately meaningless. "And then there was you," he wrote. "You were different from the start. You had a fire in you, a quiet strength that I both admired and feared. When you chose the military, I felt it as a personal betrayal. I saw it as a judgment on my life, on my values. My pride was wounded, and I lashed out in the only way I knew how, by hutting you out." He went on to explain how, over the years, he had secretly followed my career. He had kept a scrapbook, hidden in the back of his safe, filled with newspaper clippings of my promotions, my commendations, the articles that mentioned my unit's deployments. He wrote of the immense pride he had felt, a pride he had been too stubborn, too foolish to ever express. "I saw you leading your soldiers, Sullivan. I saw the respect in their eyes, the trust they placed in you. And I realized that you had built a legacy far greater than any corporate empire. You had built it with honor, with integrity, with a courage I could only dream of. You were not a disappointment, my daughter. You were and are my greatest achievement." Tears streamed down my face as I read his words, tears of sorrow for the years we had lost, for the understanding that had come too late. The inheritance, I realized, was not a reward. It was an apology. It was his way of saying, "I see you. I finally see you." It was also, I suspected, a test. He had given me the power, the control, the very things my siblings craved, to see what I would do with it. Would I be as vindictive and cruel as they had been? Or would I be the leader he had belatedly come to admire? The weight of that responsibility settled on my shoulders, heavier than any rucksack I had ever carried. I had spent my entire adult life in a world of clear-cut rules, of chains of command, of missions with defined objectives. This world, the world of trusts and portfolios and family dynamics, was a battlefield I was not trained for. The calls from Lucas and Clara became more desperate. They left long, rambling voicemails, their voices alternating between feigned remorse and thinly veiled threats. Lucas spoke of the company, of the deals he had in the pipeline, of how everything would collapse without his leadership. Clara wept about her social standing, about the humiliation she was facing, about how she would be ruined without the lifestyle to which she was accustomed. They were not sorry for how they had treated me. They were sorry they had been caught. They were sorry their benefactor was no longer pulling the strings. I met with the board of Sullivan Industries, a group of stern-faced men who looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. They had known me only as the estranged daughter, the black sheep. Now I was their new boss. I didn't try to impress them with a business acumen I didn't possess. Instead, I spoke to them in the language I knew best, the language of leadership. "I am not my father," I told them, my voice steady and clear. "I am not my brother. I will not run this company based on ego or ambition. I will run it based on integrity, on a commitment to our employees, and on a vision for a future that is both profitable and ethical. I am here to learn, and I expect your full cooperation. But make no mistake, I am in command." The initial skepticism in their eyes was replaced by a grudging respect. They were men who understood a chain of command, who recognized a leader when they saw one. I knew I had a long road ahead of me, a steep learning curve to navigate. But for the first time, I felt a sense of purpose in this new, unfamiliar world. I was no longer just the forgotten child, the disinherited daughter. I was Major Sullivan, and I had a new mission. This time, the battlefield was a boardroom, and the stakes were not just a company, but a family's legacy. And I was determined not to fail. The silence from my end was a more potent weapon than any angry tirade would have been. It drove Lucas and Clara to a state of near frenzy. They went from calling me to calling Mr. Albright, to calling members of the board, to even trying to contact my old commanding officer. Their desperation was a spectacle, a public unraveling that only served to solidify my position. They had shown their true colors, and everyone was watching. The inevitable confrontation came a week later. I had agreed to meet them at the house, on my terms, in my territory. I chose the study, my father's inner sanctum, a room that now felt like the symbolic seat of power. I sat behind the large mahogany desk, the very desk from which my father had pronounced my life a failure, and waited. They arrived together, a united front of desperation. Lucas had foregone his usual tailored suit for something more casual, an attempt, I supposed, to appear less aggressive, more approachable. It didn't work. The tension in his jaw, the frantic energy in his eyes betrayed his inner turmoil. Clara was dressed in a somber, elegant dress, her face a carefully constructed mask of remorse. She looked like a woman pleading for a pardon, not a sister seeking reconciliation. "Sullivan," Lucas began, his voice strained, attempting a tone of brotherly concern that was laughable in its insincerity. "We were worried about you. You haven't been answering our calls." I remained silent, my hands folded calmly on the desk in front of me. I let his words hang in the air, the absurdity of them exposed in the quiet of the room. "We were shocked by the will," Clara chimed in, her voice soft and trembling. "Truly shocked. We had no idea Father was, well, that he was feeling that way. He was ill, you know, he wasn't himself. They were trying to rewrite history, to create a narrative in which they were the innocent, misguided victims of a dying man's whim. They were hoping I was still the same person they had always known, the one who would back down, the one who would avoid conflict. They were about to be disappointed. He was himself enough to keep a scrapbook of my career, I said, my voice calm and even. The statement was a perfectly aimed shot, and it hit its mark. Both of them flinched, their eyes widening in surprise. They had not known about the scrapbook. It was a detail that completely undermined their story of a senile, easily manipulated old man. He was himself enough to write a letter explaining his regrets, I continued, my gaze unwavering. Regrets about his own pride, regrets about the way he treated me. Lucas's face darkened. The pretense of concern was gone, replaced by the familiar sneer. So that's it, is it? You're going to hold this over our heads? You're going to take everything and leave us with nothing? Nothing, I repeated, a humorless smile touching my lips. Clara, you have a multi-million-dollar coastal home and an art collection worth a small fortune. Lucas, you have the years of experience and the generous salary you drew from this company, not to mention the numerous investments father funded for you. You have far from nothing. What you don't have is control. And that is what this is really about, isn't it? The truth of my words silenced them. They had never been concerned about me or about our father's true wishes. They had been concerned about power, about their position, about the inheritance they had seen as their birthright. What do you want from us, Sullivan? Clara asked, her voice now a desperate whisper. What do we have to do? The question was so revealing. It was transactional, a negotiation. They still didn't understand. They thought this was a game of leverage, that I had a price. I don't want anything from you, I said, and the simple statement seemed to confuse them more than anything else. This isn't about revenge. This isn't about punishing you. This is about honoring the man my father became in his final year, not the man he was for most of his life. He entrusted me with his legacy because he believed I had the character to protect it, a character you have both proven you sorely lack. I stood up then, signaling that the meeting was over. You will both receive a generous allowance from the trust, enough to live comfortably. But you will have no say in the company, no access to the primary accounts, and no role in the family's financial affairs. Those are my terms, they are not negotiable. Lucas looked like he was about to explode. His fists were clenched, his face a mottled shade of red. You can't do this, he hissed, his voice low and menacing. I'll fight you, I'll take you to court, I'll drag your name through the mud. Go ahead, I said, my voice as cold as ice. Bring your case, let's have a public discovery process. Let's put your business dealings under a microscope. Let's subpoena your emails, your phone records. Let's see how well your reputation holds up under oath. By all means, Lucas, fight me. The threat was a calculated one, and I saw the fear in his eyes. He was a bully, but he was also a coward. He thrived in the shadows, in the world of backroom deals and whispered manipulations. The harsh light of a courtroom was the last place he wanted to be. He deflated, the rage draining out of him, leaving behind a hollow, defeated shell. He knew he had lost. Clara, on the other hand, began to cry. Not the soft, delicate tears of a grieving sister, but the harsh, ugly sobs of a woman who had just had her entire world ripped out from under her. But what will I do? She wailed. My friends, my life. Everything is tied to the Sullivan name, to the company. Then perhaps it's time you built a life of your own, I said, not unkindly. A life based on who you are, not what you have. Father gave you the house and the art collection. That's a foundation. What you build on it is up to you. I walked them to the door, the silence between us thick with the ruins of our shared history. They looked small and lost in the grand foyer, two people who had built their identities on a foundation of sand, now facing the tide coming in. As they left, I felt not a sense of victory, but a profound sadness. I had won the war, but the casualties were my own family. There was no joy in their defeat, only the quiet, somber understanding that some bonds, once broken, can never be truly mended. I had done what was right, what was just. I had honored my father's final wish. At the cost was a loneliness that echoed in the empty halls of the great house, a constant reminder of the family I had lost and the one I now had to lead. The power was mine, but it was a heavy crown to wear. In the months that followed, I threw myself into my new role with the same focused intensity I had once reserved for military operations. I treated the running of Sullivan Industries as a mission, one with complex variables, logistical challenges, and a clear, overarching objective. to reshape my father's legacy into something honorable. I spent my days in boardrooms and my nights poring over financial reports, learning the intricacies of a world that was as foreign to me as any battlefield. I made changes, some small, some seismic. I implemented a new ethics policy, cracking down on the kind of ruthless, cutthroat tactics Lucas had favored. I invested in employee development programs, creating a culture of loyalty and respect rather than fear. I established a charitable foundation in my father's name, funding programs for veterans and their families, a move that I knew would have made the man who wrote that final letter proud. There were whispers, of course. The old guard was resistant to change, and Lucas, from his self-imposed exile, did his best to sow dissent, spreading rumors that I was a naive idealist who was running the company into the ground. But the numbers told a different story. Profits were up, employee morale was at an all-time high, and Sullivan Industries was gaining a reputation not just as a powerhouse, but as a company with a conscience. I sold the coastal home Clara had so desperately wanted to keep. I gave her the full market value, of course, but I severed the tie. It was a symbol of a life of leisure and social climbing that I wanted no part of the family legacy. The art collection went to a museum, endowed with a plaque that read, "Donated in memory of a man who learned the value of true art late in life." These actions were not born of spite, but of a desire to redefine what it meant to be a Sullivan. It was no longer about ostentatious displays of wealth. It was about responsible stewardship. Clara, stripped of her primary social assets, struggled. Her fair-weather friends disappeared, and she was forced to confront a life devoid of the glamour and status she had always taken for granted. For a while, she floundered, her calls to me a mixture of bitter accusations and pathetic pleas. But then, something shifted. She started volunteering at the art museum, initially, I suspect, as a way to cling to her old life. But she discovered she had a genuine passion for it, a keen eye for curation. She enrolled in art history courses, and for the first time in her life, she was building something for herself, something that had nothing to do with her family name or her bank account. We were not close, and perhaps never would be, but a fragile, tentative line of communication opened between us. We spoke of art, of her studies, of the life she was slowly, painstakingly creating. The bitterness began to fade, replaced by a quiet, grudging respect. Lucas was a different story. He refused to accept his new reality. He saw my success as a personal affront, a constant reminder of his own downfall. He tried to launch his own ventures, but without the safety net of our father's money and the power of the Sullivan name behind him, he failed spectacularly. He grew bitter, isolated, a man consumed by his own resentment. He was a ghost haunting the edges of my new life, a cautionary tale of what happens when ambition is untethered from character. I rarely saw him, but when I did, I saw a man who had lost not just his inheritance, but his very identity. He was no longer the heir apparent. He was just a man, stripped of his power, and he didn't seem to know who that person was. One evening, I was working late in the study when I came across the scrapbook my father had kept. I opened it, and for the first time, I looked through it not as a daughter seeking approval, but as a leader trying to understand her predecessor. I saw the articles he had saved, the grainy photos of me in uniform, the notes he had scribbled in the margins. He had tracked my promotions, my deployments, my successes, and my struggles. He had been watching all along from a distance, his pride warring with his disappointment. In the back of the book, tucked into a small envelope, was a photograph I had never seen before. It was of me, on the day I had graduated from basic training. I was young, impossibly so, my face a mixture of exhaustion and fierce determination. On the back of the photo, in my father's familiar script, were 2 words, "My hero." The quiet of the study was absolute. The weight of those 2 words settled over me, a final, posthumous peace treaty. He had understood. In the end, he had finally understood. The inheritance had never been about the money or the company or the house. It had been about this. It had been about a father's recognition, a daughter's worth, and the long, difficult road to reconciliation. I had the power, the wealth, the control. But it was this small, faded photograph, this 2-word confession, that was my true inheritance. It was the legacy I would carry forward, the one I would strive to be worthy of. The loneliness was still there, a dull ache in the quiet moments, but it was no longer a void. It was filled with a sense of purpose, a sense of peace, and the quiet, unwavering knowledge that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I was no longer just the forgotten child. I was my father's hero, and that was a title worth more than any fortune.